Welcome back. Writing for a general audience is, in the first place, writing for an audience. That was the main message of last week's video. It's imagining an audience which is not there, an audience of equals, and that is what we called the classical style. And that was the main trick, I claimed. If you can apply that trick, if you somehow can psychologically make yourself see this audience for your mental eye, there's many things you don't have to learn. There's many style guides which give all kinds of tips and tricks, very specific and very precise, and they can be useful. I mean, they're definitely useful if you want to be an experienced writer. Read them. But it's more important to understand why advice like that is given. It's more important to understand why, for instance, you need to avoid jargon, which is something which all of these style guides will always tell you. Avoid jargon. Don't use words which the audience doesn't know. The issue is, why should you avoid those words? That's what you need to understand. If you understand that, you're not going to use any jargon. If you imagine your audience in the right way, you're not going to use jargon, just like you don't use jargon, I hope, to your mother or to your roommate when you're explaining what you're doing. So you don't use jargon when you are in an elevator talking to somebody about your whatever your study program is. So why do you do it when you write? It's because you don't imagine the other person doesn't know these words and, more importantly, doesn't care. They're not there to learn new words. They're there to see something interesting in the real world. Similarly, avoid cliches. It's another kind of thing which is basically mentioned always in any kind of style guide. Avoid cliches. Why? Well, cliches are a way cliches are a way of using language which draws attention to the language itself. They're kind of silly. People might not like them. People might not know them. Try to avoid those kind of things because you try to avoid drawing attention to the language. We only dare to talk about this thing in the real world which is there. Try to avoid metaphors which are too difficult. And here, this is actually a good point where you can see that it's more important to understand what's going on than to take such an advice at heart. Because you're not going to avoid all metaphors. I'm not avoiding all metaphors. I haven't avoided all metaphors. Do you believe that we're really standing in front of a landscape? I'm really pointing with my finger to a real hill, a real castle? No. They're real metaphors. But why am I using them? Because I think they help. They don't draw attention to themselves. They help you see things more concretely. They help see things for your mind's eye. Actually, I'm now drawing attention to the own trick I'm using, so that should be avoided. But here, I'm not actually using classical style. I'm being didactic. Right? So I'm trying to explain to you what is going on. Okay, so avoid all these three things. Avoid at all costs jargon and cliches, and for metaphors, the advice should be a little bit more subtle. All of that follows. It's more important that you understand why you should do those things than that you learn them by heart, I believe. Now we're ready to actually build an article. And that's what we're doing in the next 3 weeks. First, this week, we're going to set up the article to find a topic. That's called Inventio in the classical tradition. Then we're going to lay out the argument to structure the article. That's called disposition. And then finally, the third part is called execution. That's when we actually really write the individual sentences, paragraphs of the article. So that's the plan for the next 3 weeks. Inventio, dispositio, executio. All of those 3 things, again, follow from the metaphor. In Inventio, in looking for your topic, the main thing to be aware of is the so-called curse of knowledge. Curse of knowledge is something we all experience in all kinds of communication all day. It is very difficult to imagine that your partner doesn't know exactly what you know. That is part of the human condition. And even if we know it rationally, it's very difficult to internalize that in our behavior. There's a famous study, an economic study, where they asked people who knew the actual real price of oranges to price them, and then some other control group to also price those oranges. And the first group, the people who knew the real price of the oranges, tended to systematically undervalue those oranges, to give a price which was too low. People were willing to pay more for those oranges. And that is because, of course, these people knew that the clients didn't know the real price. They knew it, let's say, rationally, but still they found it too difficult to ask too much for those oranges to really imagine that those people wouldn't know. And we as students, scientists, scholars, we suffer even more from this curse of knowledge. It's very difficult for you already now to imagine that somebody doesn't know all those things you have learned in the last few years. It's very difficult to go back just a few years before you knew all of those things. But that is your task. Just always try to keep, if you want to have a career specifically in writing for a general audience, try to always keep touch with this person who didn't know all these things yet. And if that's difficult, and it is difficult, then apply just some other trick. And when you have to write, at least your article now, try to write not about your own field, but about something else, so that you don't suffer too much from your curse of knowledge. So if you're studying history, try to write about about chemistry, preferably, right? So where you are a layman yourself, and it's easier for you, it's more difficult to retrieve the knowledge, but it's easier for you to imagine somebody who doesn't have that knowledge. And there's a similar kind of problem we all have, and that's that specialists, experts, tend to be interested in research for a different reason than other people are. For us scholars and scientists, things are typically interesting because of the way they fit in the literature. In the literature, so far, everybody said X, and now this study says that not X. That's what's interesting. For general audience, that's rarely interesting because they didn't know that everybody thought X. So you first have to explain that. Then you have to explain that there were good reasons for believing X. Then you have to explain that it's actually not true. It's cumbersome. It's not interesting. People want to immediately know not X because that's what the study now is. They want to, there's a different reason why they're interested. It's interesting because it touches their own lives. It's interesting because it's about human beings. It's interesting because of all kinds of other reasons, but not because of how it fits in the literature. Forget that. And again, that's easier to do if you work on something which is not your own specialization. So that would be my suggestion. Try to find something a little bit outside of your own field, something you like, but which is a little bit outside your own field. I find it very difficult myself to explain things about my own field, more difficult than to explain them about other fields. And the reasons for that are curse of knowledge and this different interest I have. Okay, now given that, the assignment for next week is going to be find again two pieces of scientific communication, of science communication. Find them, two different ones, but again of the same kind of length of 500, 600 words, maybe more, but not less. find them, and now in this case compare those two pieces in terms of how successful their authors are in relating to their audience. Which of the two is more successful in overcoming this curse of knowledge? Which of them has found an angle to the topic which is more interesting, according to you, for general audience? Now that is, of course, a little bit subjective, but that's okay. Write 200, 300 words about which of the two you think is more interesting for general audience, which of the two overcomes the curse of knowledge better from your perspective. And then I see you next week.